The deck of the USS Zumwalt shook under the weight of arrogance. 3 young sailors watched as a 74-year-old man struggled down the metal ladder toward the engine room, trying to fix the main motor that had failed. His appearance was simple, a grease-stained shirt, and hands that carried the marks of decades of labor. Tyler was the first to laugh. "Well, look who they sent. This has to be a joke. Go home, Grandpa, this ship isn't for you." They didn't notice the captain approaching quietly behind them. He had heard every word. Another sailor, realizing the captain was near, tried to run ahead to warn his friends. But it was too late. Moments later, the captain spoke 4 words that silenced their laughter and filled the air with tension. He built this ship. The silence that followed the captain's words was crushing. Tyler felt his blood run cold as he slowly turned, meeting Captain Morrison's piercing gaze. Beside him, Jake and Marcus stood frozen, the smirks wiped clean from their faces. The sailor who had tried to warn them, Rick, stopped a few feet away, panting and visibly embarrassed. "Sir, Tyler began, but his voice broke. The captain raised a hand commanding silence without a word. His eyes swept across the 3 young men with a mix of disappointment and authority, sharper than any shout. "You 3, Captain Morrison said, "just humiliated the man who designed every inch of this destroyer. Robert Linford is a living legend in American naval engineering." Jake swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the captain's words. Marcus looked down, unable to meet Morrison's eyes. "Gentlemen," the captain continued, his voice echoing across the deck, "you are serving aboard one of the most advanced vessels in the United States Navy. This ship represents decades of innovation, research, and dedication. And the man you just told to go home has devoted 50 years of his life to this country." Tyler felt the shame like a heavy anchor dragging him down. He had joined the Navy full of pride, dreaming of serving his country. Now, just 6 months after graduation, he was standing before his captain being reprimanded for disrespecting the very kind of man he should have admired. Captain Morrison stepped closer. "When the main engine failed this morning, our best engineers spent 4 hours trying to identify the problem. 4 wasted hours, because no one here had enough experience with this specific system. Do you know what Mr. Linford did when he arrived? He immediately found a fault in the secondary turbine's pressure regulator." Marcus's stomach turned. He had been one of the engineers working that morning, completely lost in the system's complexity. Now he realized the man who could have guided them from the start had been met with mockery and contempt. "Mr. Linford could be retired right now," Morrison said, "enjoying a peaceful life with his family. But when we sent the emergency call, he didn't hesitate. He caught the first flight to San Diego and came here ready to help. And how did you welcome him?" No one dared answer. The ocean breeze brushed across the deck, but none of the 3 sailors felt its coolness. They were suffocating under the weight of their ignorance and arrogance. Jake finally found the courage to speak. "Sir, we didn't know. We had no idea who he was." Captain Morrison looked at Jake with an expression that mixed pity and firmness. "And that, sailor, is exactly the problem. You judged a man by his appearance, by his age. You didn't care to ask who he was or why he was here. You just assumed you knew better, that you belonged here more than he did." The words cut deep. Tyler thought of his own grandfather, a Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke about his service, but whose eyes carried stories of courage and sacrifice. He imagined how he'd feel if someone treated his grandfather with the same disdain they had shown Mr. Linford. Rick, the sailor who had tried to warn them, stood apart, relieved not to have joined the mockery, but still guilty for not arriving sooner. He knew Linford's reputation. He had read about him during training. The man was considered one of the brightest naval engineers of his generation. "You 3 will head down to the engine room," Captain Morrison ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You will apologize to Mr. Linford personally. Then you'll spend the next several hours assisting him with whatever he needs. I want you to watch every move, every decision, every adjustment he makes. Maybe then you'll understand what being a true professional means." "Yes, sir," the 3 replied in unison, their voices weak and full of regret. As they prepared to descend, Tyler looked at the metal ladder Mr. Linford had climbed down just minutes earlier. Now that descent looked steeper, far more intimidating. Not because of the depth or the noise of the engine room, but because of the man waiting below. How do you look into the eyes of someone you've humiliated and ask for forgiveness? How do you regain respect you should never have lost? Captain Morrison watched the three sailors begin their descent, then turned to Rick. "You're going too," he said. "Not to apologize, but to learn. I want all of you to understand the value of experience and humility." Rick nodded respectfully and followed the others. As he stepped down the metal stairs, he could hear the distant clatter of tools and the low hum of auxiliary systems. Somewhere down there, Mr. Linford was working quietly, repairing the ship he himself had helped design. No resentment, no demand for recognition. Just doing what he'd always done, his job with excellence and dedication. The descent down the ladder felt endless. Each step echoed under the sailors' boots, a hollow metallic rhythm announcing their arrival heavy with shame. Tyler led the group, his heartbeat quickening with every foot closer to the engine room. When they finally reached the lower level, they found Mr. Linford kneeling beside an open panel, his seasoned hands handling tools with a precision that contrasted sharply with the apparent frailty of his age. He didn't look up right away. He was focused, adjusting something deep within the mechanism. The dim light of the engine room cast soft shadows across his wrinkled face, each line telling stories of decades spent in this very kind of work. Tyler took a step forward, his throat tightening. "Mr. Linford," he began, his voice cracking slightly. The old engineer paused for a moment but kept working, carefully turning a small part with a specialized wrench. "Sir," Tyler tried again, this time with more steadiness. "We came to apologize. What we said up there was unforgivable. We had no right to talk to you that way." Jake and Marcus stepped up beside Tyler, their heads bowed in remorse. Rick stood a step behind them, silent and watchful. Mr. Linford finally finished his adjustment and slowly set the tool aside. Using a nearby handrail, he pushed himself up with visible effort. His knees cracked as he straightened, and Tyler instinctively reached out to help. But the old man declined with a gentle gesture. When Robert Linford finally met their eyes, there was no anger in his gaze, only a deep sadness, and something that looked a lot like understanding. He wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag and sighed. "You know," he began, his voice calm but weighted with experience. "When I was your age, I thought I knew everything too. I believed youth and energy could solve any problem." He paused, glancing around the room as if seeing something beyond the steel walls. "It took one near-fatal mistake for me to learn otherwise." The four sailors stood silent, realizing he wasn't just accepting their apology. He was about to teach them something. "It was 1978, Linford continued, leaning lightly against the panel. "I was a young engineer, fresh out of school, working on one of the first advanced propulsion systems for destroyers. There was a senior engineer on that project, a man named Arthur Coleman. He was almost 70 then. My colleagues and I thought he was outdated, that his methods were too old-fashioned." A chill ran down Tyler's spine. The parallel was painful. "One day," Linford went on, "I completely ignored one of Mr. Coleman's recommendations about the cooling system calibration. I thought my calculations were superior. I was confident, arrogant, really." He paused, eyes distant, reliving the memory. 3 weeks later, during sea trials, the system failed. We nearly caused a fire that could have cost lives. Marcus swallowed hard, imagining the gravity of that mistake. "Mr. Coleman didn't humiliate me," Linford said softly. "He simply brought me back to the drafting table and showed me, step by step, why his recommendation mattered. He taught me that experience isn't just about technical knowledge. It's about understanding how systems behave in the real world, under stress, in situations no manual can fully prepare you for." The old engineer walked slowly to a nearby workbench and unfolded a large technical blueprint. It was a detailed drawing of the USS Zumwalt's propulsion system. "See this here?" he said, pointing to a specific section. "That's the pressure regulator that failed today. I designed it 15 years ago, but I based it on principles I learned more than 40 years ago from men like Arthur Coleman. Every line in this drawing represents not just calculations, but lessons learned, mistakes corrected, and lives protected. Jake stared at the blueprint in awe. The complexity of the design was staggering, but what struck him most was the realization that every detail had been shaped by someone who truly understood, not just theory, but reality. "When you laughed at me up there," Linford said, not accusing, just stating, "you weren't mocking an old man. You were mocking decades of accumulated knowledge, sacrifice, and dedication to the safety of every sailor who serves on these ships." He looked at each of them in turn. "But I accept your apology," he said quietly, "because I've been where you are. I've made the same mistake, underestimating experience, and if I can turn that old mistake into a lesson for you, maybe the cycle can be broken." Rick, who had been silent until then, took a step forward. "Mr. Linford, I read about your work during training. You changed the way we think about naval propulsion systems. It's an honor to be here, sir." Linford smiled for the first time, a tired, genuine smile. "The honor's mine, son. Working alongside young sailors who want to learn, who are humble enough to admit mistakes and grow from them. That's what keeps hope alive." He turned back to the open panel. "Now then, if you really want to apologize, how about helping me finish this repair?" The four sailors stepped forward, forming a half circle around the old engineer. Tyler grabbed a flashlight and illuminated the workspace without being asked. Marcus opened his notebook, ready to jot down every step. Jake shifted to get a better view of the system. And there, in the warm hum of the engine room, a true lesson began. Not just about naval engineering, but about humility, respect, and the priceless value of lived experience. Linford pointed inside the panel, where a maze of pipes and valves formed a complex metallic network. "Take a look here," he said, his voice taking on the tone of a seasoned instructor. "This pressure regulator didn't fail by accident. The system's been giving off small warning signs for days, maybe even weeks. Did any of you notice anything unusual in the engine's behavior recently?" Marcus flipped quickly through his notebook, stopping on a specific page. "Sir, over the past 10 days we recorded small pressure fluctuations in the secondary turbine. But they were within acceptable limits, so we didn't look into it further." Linford nodded, tracing a line along a specific pipe with his finger. "Exactly. And that's the difference between following a manual and truly understanding a system. Acceptable limits are based on ideal conditions, but a system like this is a living organism. It speaks to you through those small fluctuations, those whispers most people ignore." He picked up a specialized wrench, clearly modified over the years. "Let me show you something you won't find in any manual. See this valve?" He set the wrench at a specific angle and applied slow, steady pressure. A faint hiss of air escaped. "You hear that? That's the sound of a seal beginning to lose efficiency. Not enough to cause an immediate failure, but enough to trigger a chain of small issues that eventually lead to what happened today." Tyler watched in fascination, realizing he was witnessing decades of practical knowledge being shared. This was something he'd never learned in training, and it certainly wasn't in any of the technical manuals he'd studied. "Now," Linford continued, handing the flashlight to Jake, "shine it right here. Tyler, hand me that torque wrench on the bench, the variable calibration one, not the standard." The sailors moved in perfect sync, anticipating the engineer's needs as he worked. It was like a silent dance, a ritual of learning and redemption. "All right," Linford said after about 40 minutes of meticulous work. "Now we'll test the system under low pressure first. Tyler, head to that control panel over there and start the test sequence. I'll walk you through it step by step." Tyler approached the panel, his hands trembling slightly, not from technical nerves, but from the weight of responsibility. Mr. Linford was trusting him, teaching him, despite everything that had happened. "First, activate the safety bypass," Linford instructed, moving to stand beside him. "That'll let us start the system without triggering emergency protocols. See that blue switch? Turn it 90 degrees clockwise." Tyler followed carefully. The panel lit up with a series of indicator lights. "Now watch that pressure gauge," Linford continued. "When I give the signal, press the green button to start the flow at 10% capacity. We want to see how the system responds before increasing it gradually. Jake and Marcus moved to nearby monitoring panels, ready to report any anomalies. Now, Linford said calmly. Tyler pressed the button. A low hum began to fill the engine room, growing steadily. The gauges started to move, the needles rising slowly but smoothly. Pressure stable at 10%, Marcus reported, eyes fixed on the gauge. Temperature within limits, Jake added. Linford didn't just watch the digital readings. He placed his hand on one of the main pipes, feeling the vibration. Bring it up to 20%, he instructed. The process continued, methodical, patient. With each increase, Linford explained what should happen, what to look for, what signs might indicate a problem. The young sailors absorbed every word. At 50% power, Linford suddenly raised his hand. Hold it there. He leaned in close to a specific junction, pressing his ear to the metal. Right here, he said, pointing. There's a second issue we haven't addressed. Hear that sound? It's faint, but it's there. A slight misalignment between this pipe and the main distributor. Rick stepped closer, trying to listen. It took a few seconds, but finally he caught it. A barely perceptible ticking sound, rhythmic yet uneven. How can you even hear that with all this noise? Rick asked, genuinely amazed. Linford smiled. 50 years of listening to engines, son. You develop a sixth sense for it. Like a musician who can pick out one wrong note in an entire orchestra. He picked up another tool and began adjusting the connection. This wouldn't cause a failure right away, but over weeks it would wear unevenly and eventually rupture. I'm fixing it now so you won't have to deal with it later. The four sailors exchanged looks, each thinking the same thing. If they had held on to their arrogance, they would have missed this priceless opportunity to learn from a true master. After another 30 minutes of fine-tuning, Mr. Linford finally stepped back, wiping his hands again. There. Bring the system up to 100%. It'll run perfectly now. Tyler entered the final commands, and the USS Zumwalt's main engine roared fully back to life. The sound was different, smoother, more balanced. Gone were the tiny irregularities the crew had grown used to ignoring. Marcus stared at the readings in awe. It's perfect. All values not just within range. They're at optimal levels. Captain Morrison, who had quietly come down during the final phase of the repair, watched from a discreet distance. He saw not just a technical fix, but a transformation taking place in his young sailors. Mr. Linford, the captain said, stepping forward, once again you've proven indispensable. On behalf of the entire crew of the USS Zumwalt, you have my gratitude. Linford nodded respectfully. The gratitude's mine, Captain. These young men have tremendous potential. Captain Morrison watched the four sailors for a moment before continuing. What you witnessed today wasn't just a repair. It was a lesson in the true meaning of service. Mr. Linford could have refused our call. He could have held on to resentment after the way he was treated. But he chose to teach, to share, to be greater than the moment. Linford carefully put away his tools, each one in its exact place inside the worn toolbox he had brought. You know, he said while closing the box, the real test of character isn't how you act when you're respected. It's how you respond when you're not. Today, you had the courage to admit a mistake, to apologize, and to learn. In the hours that followed, as the USS Zumwalt prepared to resume operations, something had changed on deck. The story of what had happened spread among the crew, not as gossip, but as a story worth telling, a lesson worth keeping. When Mr. Linford was finally ready to leave the ship, a small crowd of sailors had gathered. There were no grand speeches, no formal ceremony, just a quiet acknowledgement, an exchange of looks that carried respect, admiration, and gratitude. Tyler, Jake, and Marcus walked with him to the gangway. Before leaving, Linford handed Tyler a small, worn notebook. These are notes I've taken over the years. Small observations, lessons learned, mistakes corrected. You won't find them in any official manual, but they might come in handy. Tyler held the notebook as if it were a precious treasure. Sir, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything. Just promise me you'll pass this knowledge on. Teach those who come after you with the same patience you hope to receive. Break the cycle of arrogance. Be the bridge between generations. I promise, sir, Tyler replied, his voice steady and sincere. As Linford walked down the gangway, Captain Morrison called for attention. "Attention," he commanded. The entire crew stood at attention and saluted. They all understood they were in the presence of a man who had dedicated his life to designing and building safe, efficient ships. They all understood the value of that veteran. Robert Linford paused for a moment, turned, and returned the salute with quiet dignity. Then, with slow but determined steps, he walked toward the parking lot. That night, Tyler opened the notebook he'd been given. On the first page, written by hand, was a single line. "Knowledge without humility is dangerous." He flipped through the pages, finding decades of valuable insights, detailed diagrams, and creative solutions to complex problems. But more important than any technical detail was the message behind every note, that true professionalism isn't just about knowing how to do the job, but caring deeply about why and for whom you do it. In the months that followed, Tyler, Jake, and Marcus became known among the crew, not for their past arrogance, but for their transformation. They sought out the most experienced members of the team, asked questions, listened carefully, and recognized that there was always more to learn. Mr. Linford's notebook became an unofficial legacy, passed from hand to hand, each generation adding its own lessons learned, its own stories of humility and growth. Because in the end, the greatest gift Robert Linford left behind wasn't just a repaired engine or an optimized system. It was the understanding that true mastery comes with humility, that experience deserves respect, and that the most valuable wisdom is the kind we choose to share generously, even when we aren't treated with the dignity we deserve. And so, on the deck of the USS Zumwalt, Captain Morrison's 4 words echoed whenever they were needed. He built this ship, a reminder that lived on in transformed hearts, open minds, and the renewed promise that youth and experience were never rivals, but partners, that mistakes were chances to grow, not signs of weakness, and that respect was the foundation upon which everything else was built. That 74-year-old man had taught them the true meaning of serving with excellence and humility. If you enjoyed this story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about unsung heroes who deserve to be recognized.